objects 1, indicating tomorrow is going to be objects 2. So you'll be doing a lot of objects over the next few days, and it's probably like one of the most important things that you'll learn about JavaScript because really like objects like is I would argue one of the most common non-primitive. Well, it is the only non-primitive data type, but really in terms of like real world use, objects are everywhere. Like if you ever go to a website, you know, giving someone like if I was logging to Facebook, right, and like if you think about the way Facebook responds, right, I wouldn't be like, hey Facebook, what's my username? It's like Facebook, oh, this is your username. What's my password? This is your password. What's the date? This is the date, right? Like that seems kind of really kind of confusing, right, and very onerous. Objects are basically, think of it as like you can call it a hash and call it a dictionary. But in my mind, I think of it as just like this dump of like just everything, right? It basically the basic layout for an object is you have a key and you have a value, right? So for Facebook, it might just say here's my user object. The key is name and my name is a value. The key is password. The value is my password, right? And so you can create this dictionary of like multiple values that you can read and grab all at once. And really, it's just like a really efficient way to in my opinion at least, to transport large batches of information. Objects are defined with the curly braces, and one thing to note here is that objects. The most important thing about objects in terms of accessing it is to realizing that objects have no order, right? And an array, when we iterate through an array, there's a sense of like, hey, this comes first, then this, then this, then this, right? It's a list. There's a priority. In objects, there is no queue. There is no priority. There is no order. Even if, in this case, the way we define this is like, well, clearly, hello comes above full here. Like, even though we define it this way, when we access it, there's nothing in JavaScript that tells us that hello comes before full. Okay, so just to know that like with objects, rather than thinking that all the keys are sequential, there is no sequence, right? It's pretty much just everything is kind of on an even plane, right? It's like a dictionary. But imagine if like the dictionary wasn't in alphabetical order, like every word is just kind of on the same parallel plane here. Another word for these keys is called properties. So you'll hear me use properties and keys interchangeably, but really they're referring to the same thing. And the values are just the values. In an object, every key has a value, and vice versa. If it doesn't follow that relationship, then it's not an object. Okay. Yeah, and then so here we pretty much kind of go a little bit more in depth about making a dictionary object, right? Making it look like an actual dictionary where we're defining words. But really like the two things from here that you really just should kind of drill into yourself really is that one, the keys are always going to be strings, no matter what. In this case, notice how this text is black, right? And normally when we see a black text, what does that represent? Well, here it's a key, but normally outside of a context of objects, whenever we see black text, what does it represent? A variable, right? In this case, there is no variable called intimation, right? Instead, because we know for a fact that in JavaScript the keys have to be strings, we can write this, and JavaScript is just going to convert it to a string for us when we store it. Like that's how strictly that idea is enforced, right? We don't even need to say this is a string. JavaScript knows this is a string. Why? Because JavaScript says it cannot be anything else. Even if you put the number 6 in here, JavaScript's gonna say, oh great, you meant the string with the character 6 in it. Like that's how that goes, right? So you can't have booleans, you can't have numbers, you can't have anything. The key has to be a string in JavaScript. Yep. Quotes? Either one. If you write it without quotes, it will convert it. It will run probably 2 string on it and try to convert it into a string. If you write it in quotes, it will say, okay, great, I'll just ship it out. I don't know. Like, I would say don't worry too much about it. Write whatever you're most comfortable with. In my mind, I'm thinking like if you write it as a string, then JavaScript is just going to take it and use it. If you write it as anything else, JavaScript needs to run toString on it, which I guess could be an extra step, but like with today's processing power, it seems almost like a negligible like mood detail. In terms of what looks better, I think that looks pretty good. I think it really depends on what you want, but I haven't heard either way is like better or like more common than the other. Usually, like when things are better, there's usually like a reason for it. In this case, I feel like there's not too much reason. People don't really care too much about it necessarily. Okay, cool. And in the same way that in a dictionary you get a definition by looking up the word, in an object you find the value by looking up the key or looking up the property. So, So we look up the value by the key, and we'll do a few examples of that going on or further off. Okay, cool. So this is one of the reasons why I was saying earlier objects are really commonly used. In the same way that an array can hold nested arrays, nested objects, objects can also hold any data types, including other objects, right? So it's very common to see things like nested objects. And once again, once you get into things that are very heavily nested, indentation super important. Like people will get mad at you if your JSON, if your objects are not properly indented, because people make a lot of assumptions about indentation and what that means when you're traversing through a particular object. But once again, because there is no sense of order, there is no length property. So don't think you can do an objects.length to tell you how many keys something has. There is a way to get the keys of an object and show that value as an array, which a quick Google search will probably help point you in the right direction of how to do that. It'll be good. I'm not telling you the answer just because I want you to have the experience of having to look that up and get more into the documentation. And yeah, it can go as deep as you want it to go. Here we have nested, not just arrays, but nested arrays, nested objects, whatever you want. So this is why we want to say that objects can be a really good dumping ground for a lot of information. Yeah.
So the array there is going to keep being an array. It's going to be a string, according to what you said before.
What I said before is only applies to keys, only applies to properties, right? This is a value. This is an array. Only the key is a string. Okay. So this word array is a string. This word boolean is a string. This str is a string. On the right hand side, this is whatever the data type is. This is something that I think gets a lot of folks in trouble because it's very convenient, but it's like a double-edged sword. There's some trade-offs here. How to accessing objects. First, let's do the thing that how should I start this? Okay. In arrays, we want to access a particular index, right? We pass it a number within the square brackets, and we say, hey, go to this position, get me that element, and give it back to me, right? In objects, we also have a very similar way of doing that. Except in objects, what we do is we actually pass it a string, okay? And we pass it we pass it a string and it looks for a property or a key with that string value and gives you back the value, okay? So objects can be accessed via what we call bracket notation. Notice how here, this str, we have to explicitly say, we have to explicitly put it in quotes. Tell JavaScript that it's in fact like an str as a string, not str as a variable. Down here, what we can do is we can actually feed it a variable that eventually becomes a string, and then we can also access the object that way. So bracket notation gives us the flexibility of being able to access it with either directly a string or with a variable that represents a string value. Okay. The other way to access an object is with something called dot notation. Dot notation is somewhat tricky to use, and so what it does is it basically is going to assume that whatever you type after the dot notation is going to be a string. Okay? When we say .str, it's JavaScript is going to make the assumption on your behalf that you may say to basically do bracket this thing, this str, it's a string, not a variable, nothing else. It's going to assume for you that it's a string. So you do this, okay? People like using dot notation because nice. It's easy to use. But the limitations of dot notation are that you can't do dot and then put in a variable name, right? Because your JavaScript can't tell, or JavaScript is going to say that, well, the only reason why you ever use dot is to give me something that's going to convert it into a string, right? So if I'm going to try to do crazy object dot, in this case my key, it will think my key is a string, not my key is a variable. Okay, so we use dot notation here. Make sure that whatever you're writing after the dot is literally what you want to be converted into a string before you use it. Secondly, because this is going to be converted into a string, we also really can't have any, we can't have anything like spaces or weird characters in there. If you do, go to this notation. This lets you have spaces in the string, whatever, right? Here you can't because it's dot whatever, and you can't have a space in the middle of a function call. So what my advice to you here is, once as you're starting off and learning to use objects, I would probably start with bracket notation first, because bracket notation is very universally accepted. It will cover all use cases, all edge cases. And then once you're comfortable with the idea of an object and accessing it with the bracket notation, over time, if you want to try some dot notation, feel free to do that as well. Just know that there are certain keys that are not accessible with dot notation, but all keys are accessible via bracket notation. Yeah.
This question might be a little bit out of scope of the class, but I have used dot like for programming at home. Can you use it to access other classes?
Yeah.
Because I think, okay, yeah, I know what this is.
So basically, from what you just said, if I were to do crazy object or crazy obj dot boolean in an effort to try to access the boolean true, would I not receive the boolean true? Would I receive string true?
No, you will return. You receive the boolean true. Okay. Boolean is what? The key or the value?
That's the key.
Okay. Keys are strings.
Right.
Values are values.
Oh, so it won't it's not going to change the value into a string. It's only going to change whatever the notation is that you put behind the dot into a string. And if it's already just a key, it's already string anyway, so it doesn't matter. Correct?
Right. Like what I said about like keys can only be strings, right? It just means only keys are only strings. Like the value is completely independent of the key, right? It's almost like if you do have a dictionary, right? The definition could be a number, it could be a picture, it could be whatever it is. That's great. But when I look up a dictionary, like the word has to be like text, right? Like I can't have a dictionary with like 100 words in alphabetical order and then like a picture, because I don't know how to search for a picture, right? That's what I mean when I say that the key is going to be converted into a string. A key is always a string. The value is whatever the data type you want it to be. Lawrence? Oh.
Do you use dot notation to access nested objects? So if I want to get the key from yet another object, it'll be crazy object, dot nested object, dot yet another object, dot key.
Yeah, we'll talk about that in a later slide about nested stuff. It's very similar to the idea of a nested array, right? Like as long as what you currently have is the way that JavaScript does is like it will try to do what you want it to do. So if you try to do layers of nesting, whether it's an array or an object, it'll just try to do it. And if it can't do it, then it'll say, hey, I had an error where you asked me to do this and I couldn't do it. So yeah, you can definitely chain together some of this stuff too. Okay. So more kind of red warning signs for dot and bracket notation. Dot notation, right, does not support variables. Whatever you do dot it has to be the string. If it's not the string, it will probably return undefined and say, hey, you're looking for a key that doesn't exist in this object. And then similarly, whatever you put in the bracket, if you put a variable, if you put my var in here, that's great. It's going to look for a key called my var. If you look for my var as a variable, which in this case is hello, then you'll get back world as a string. Okay. So just make sure that whatever you're doing inside the bracket, it eventually becomes what you need the key's name to be in a string form. Okay. In this case, I mean, this is I think like just a rehash of the last point too, which is this idea that like with key one and key two, um, dot key one will work. Dot or doing it this way will also work too. But just that whenever if you ever do decide to use this something as a variable, right? Like inside the bracket, it's evaluated, right? Not used like notation means that it's used directly. Inside the bracket means it's the expression is evaluated first and then it's used. So that's why on this one too, right? The idea is that like, hey, if I try to use bracket notation for something that says key one and it's a variable, then it's going to look up whatever the variable represents, right? Not key one, like in quotes, like we do for dot notation. It's just something that like as you do it a few times, you'll get a hang of it. As opposed to kind of like what dot notation and what bracket notation allows you to do. And eventually you also get a good sense of kind of what dot notation doesn't let you do. Okay. Creating an object. So creating an object, you've seen a few examples here, right? Using the curly brace really is probably the most straightforward way. Objects are, as are arrays, they're non-primitives, which means we can change it, right? And so what that means is, hey, we can create an object with, in this case, we have two properties, and because we're going to change it, we can always change any one of those values, or we can add new keys and new values at our discretion, right? We can do whatever we want to it. So here then, in line one, what we're doing is we're creating an empty object that has nothing, and then we can just either use bracket notation or dot notation to actually not just access values, but then assign, like say, like have those keys, and then we can use the equal sign to assign values to those keys, right? In this case, what's going to happen is if our object already has a key called hello, and then we do object.hello equals world, then we overwrite the previous value with our new value. If that key didn't exist before, then we're creating it. In either case, we actually can't tell if we're overwriting anything or not. So that's why in a lot of code, you'll see people in the way the code is set up is they'll have an if statement that says, if this key's value does not exist, set it equal to this, right? And it's something you want to do just to be safe. You're not overwriting anything that was already previously there. So this is just to tell you that you can assign values in the same way that you access values with both bracket and with dot notation. Yeah. So in this case, the how should I say this? Properties and methods are like pretty much like, so a property is something that you can access on an object, and a method is a property that happens to be a function. So basically, if anything attached to like if you access something, if you say, like, for example, if I say array.length, is that a property or a method on the array? Why property?
Because it doesn't have a function. You just can do dot length. But if you have, but the method is something like to uppercase, and then you put the parentheses.
Right. So so basically one good way to know if something is a property versus a method is if when you access it, do you need to invoke it, right? You do the open and close parentheses, right? Because functions can only be used if they're invoked, right? Whereas properties are just accessed, right? So in this case, for this, obj with methods here, right? We have a bunch of properties, which are, say, if I just do obj with methods dot property 1 and dot property 2, that will give me back whatever values they have, right? If I wanted to actually do this thing, I need to do dot say hello, but I need to add the open and close parentheses after it, right? Otherwise, remember during the first day of class, I had something where I called two upper or two lowercase, but I didn't invoke it, right? All that did was it would tell me that, hey David, great, this method does exist, right? It didn't do anything; it just told me that it existed. So once again, if it's something that you have to use by invoking it, then it's a method. But this is just like a verbal distinction between the two, and it basically just tells you that, hey, you can also attach functions to objects as well. And then I guess Lawrence, to your point now, nested objects, right? Once again, objects are very powerful because we can dump as many things as we wanted them, and so accessing a nested object is oh, there was an animation there. My bad. Accessing a nested object is very similar to accessing nested arrays or nested anything else for that matter. Right? So we do baseball team dot Yankees. What that's going to do is that's going to give us this object here, right? And now that we have an object, we can always just do dot location, right? Or bracket string location, right? So we can chain together these things, as much as we want to, like we could do with arrays. And a good rule of thumb to know kind of what you're looking at is if we do try to chain too many things together, right? The way JavaScript evaluates that is if I have baseball teams dot Yankees dot location, it will say, okay, baseball teams, does that support anything that has dot Yankees? Okay, it will try doing that first. And if it fails, then it will throw an error saying, hey, this doesn't exist, or hey, you can't do that, right? If it does work, it will say, great, baseball team dot Yankees. Now, if I do baseball team dot Yankees dot location, it will say, great, baseball team dot Yankees gave me this. Can I do dot location, or does it have a property called dot location? If it does, it will run it. If it doesn't, it will throw an error and yell at me and say, hey, you can't do that, right? So with nested objects, just make sure at each stage when you're trying to chain together with the next thing or access the next thing, just make sure that the thing right before is something that for which you can do the thing you want to do next, right? Like it happens in very, very straightforward linear sequence from left to right. Like I'll do the first thing first, then I'll do dot whatever it is you want me to do. Then if you enter the dot, I'll do what you want me to do like given what the first two dots return. So you just kind of traverse down where you go through the iterations. So one common mistake that a lot of developers make is, let's say so Yankees, Mets, Cubs. Let's take their restaurants, right? If I try to do baseball teams dot Yankees dot location, it will give me back New York. Pretty straightforward. But if I try to do baseball teams dot Red Sox dot location, what's going to happen? Or rather, what would the error that I would get be?
Dot Red Sox?
Yeah.
It didn't exist.
So what error would I get?
No?
Now we're just guessing, huh?
But it wouldn't be undefined, right?
Okay, so if I try to do console.log baseball teams dot Yankees dot location, I get back New York. Cool, that makes sense. That's exactly what I thought it would be. However, if I try to do baseball team dot Yank dot Red Sox dot location, who can tell me what I get? Or who can describe for me like what error I will probably get? I don't just say it won't work. Like, what error? Like, at what point is this going to break? Okay, so what kind of reference error? Okay, so let me just okay. So reference error, and then we're trying to say accessing parameter that doesn't exist. Cool. Any other guesses? Well, so you think it will return back undefined? Okay. Anything else?
Could possibly return the last thing that was like the last location that was listed.
The last location. So what would that be?
Just guess.
Okay. Yeah. I know. So you came a little bit late. So
I know. So
no. Well, I'm saying that. So one of the things we talked about earlier in class was just like in an object. unlike an array, one of the things to know about an object is there's no idea of order. Like everything's at the same like level. If you will. It's not like, oh, I checked this first, and I checked this, and I checked this. It's like everything's checked at once. So there's no like last in terms of like in objects. Okay. Any other guesses for what other things we could be seeing here? Okay. So who thinks it's a reference error? 1, 2, 3. Kaz, are you not gonna vote for your answer? Type error. Okay. What kind of type error? Okay. So say that again for me. What can I be a property? What can I be a property? Sorry, say out louder. Are you running your computer right now? Okay.
What is the difference between a type error and a reference error? Oh, just type error means it exists there, but you misspelled it.
Yeah. I mean, I think honestly, I think documentation probably do a better job of explaining exactly like when they throw references versus type errors. But at a high level, like I guess if these three are the kinds of three possible, so I guess like who votes for reference error? 1, 2, Becky, are you half? You're all the way there. Okay, 4. Okay, so 4 for reference error. How many for undefined? Chris, Justin, are you really not able for undefined, Dennis? Yeah. Okay. 4, 2, and then who votes for type error? Kaz. It's 1. Okay. Cash, what do you think the answer is? Oh, okay, so there was 5 for reference error then. 5 for. Cool. Okay, so. Okay, so let's talk about this. Okay, so. How should I do this? Okay, if I console.log out baseball teams, what do I get? Yeah, I get back the object. Oh shoot! I get back the object, right? So far so good. Okay. Then I do Red Sox or baseball teams dot Red Sox. What do I get now? Do I get one of these errors? Or just add it?
I mean, it doesn't exist unless I'm not reading properly. It doesn't exist there. It's not there, right?
Mm-hmm.
So it's not there. So basically, we're asking for something that is not there. It's not that it's there and it's undefined. It's just not. Oh, it is undefined.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it undefined?
Well, no. We're two thirds of the way through, right? We're only 1 dot through our answer, right? So, what?
You was asking for Red Sox documentation, right?
Right. Yeah. Okay. So why does JavaScript values return undefined for non-existent key? Google's actually remarkably good at. Oh, maybe not in this case. Google's remarkably good at translating like really like verbose programming questions into like the first Stack Overflow solution. Okay, so let me try something in Google. So JavaScript default object value. Oh. No, these are all about setting it, which I guess makes sense, right? What? I'm sorry? Why is JavaScript object value undefined. Okay. Let's see some of these. And the reason why I'm doing this is because